Welcome everyone to visionrecordingstudios.com and thehomestudiotrainer.com. This video is my contribution to a little project that Johnny at the Home Studio Trainer and I embarked on together, which was this. And one of the live streams about a month or so ago at the Home Studio Trainer, we discussed taking the same piece of music, having Johnny and myself both separately mix the same piece of music in Studio One Pro, with Johnny using just the Presonus stock plugins that came with Studio One and no other plugins, no other third-party stuff, just the stock plugins from Presonus. And I, on the other hand, was going to mix that same song with only third-party plugins and not use any of the Presonus plugins. And we wanted to do this to try this little experiment because I know on the Home Studio Trainer, and also I've gotten these questions through my YouTube channel and through emails and stuff from guys that are just starting out recording and beginning mix engineers. And the question has come up to both Johnny and myself many times, whether or not you can really record a professional sounding record with just stock plugins, or do you need to go out and buy some third-party plugins or use only third-party plugins? Do the third-party plugins sound better? So on and so forth. And I know when I first started out, I always thought, when I didn't know any better, that, the more you spend on a plugin, the better that the mix is going to sound. And what you come to find out, and what I'm trying to pass on to people that I teach that are just starting out in recording and mixing, is that knowing how to use the plugins that you have is a far better approach, and you'll get far better results than just going out and buying a bunch of expensive plugins that you really don't know how to use. Because if you can't use the stock plugins effectively, you're going to have the same problem when you have third-party plugins. Now, that's not to say that third-party plugins aren't great and there aren't some great stuff out there. There is, and I have some of those things, and I'm going to show you those today. And I think you'll probably come to the conclusion at one point in your mix career that you're probably going to have, like myself, and I know Johnny does as well, has a hybrid approach where they use some stock plugins, and he also uses some third-party stuff. I do that. Johnny does that. A lot of guys do that. But we wanted to kind of show that, yes, you can absolutely use just stock plugins and get the same professional results as you can with third-party. And we thought by having two different people approach this mix, not only would be able to kind of do that little experiment that I just mentioned about the plugins, but then we can also show some of the members of the homestudiotrainer.com site, two different guys that mix, on a professional level, where you can kind of look over our shoulder, if you will, and we could take you through a mix on how we do things. So not only will you get, this little experiment with the plugins, but you also hopefully will get something out of watching Johnny mix a song, watching myself mix a song, and that you can learn something on how, take some of the ideas that maybe we have that you haven't thought of and add it to your, bag of tricks or your toolbox as a mix engineer. And I wish I had that when I was starting out many years ago. So I think it would be, we thought it would be a great thing to not only do a little bit of teaching and give people some information, but also do this experiment with the plugins, and it would just work out really well. And hopefully it would also drive some more questions and some more, conversations about the whole mixing process and how you go from a beginner to a more intermediate and advanced mix engineer. And then also on the Home Studio Trainer website, there's also a lot of advanced guys there as well, not just beginners, but also guys that have been doing this a long time, and they can also chime in. And so we thought this video would actually drive a whole bunch of conversations around the whole topic of mixing. So that's kind of the synopsis of what this whole thing is about. So what this video is going to entail, it's going to be a couple of different parts. I'm going to try to record this all at once, but I have to apologize up front. I've had an extremely real nasty cold for the last week or so. So I'm probably going to lose my voice somewhere halfway through this and have to record this in two parts, but I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to try not to cough into the microphone too much. So I apologize up front. I've been really sick, and I'm just trying to get this thing done because I want to get this out to you guys. So bear with me. So having said that, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you. And before we get to the song itself, I need to give a shout out to Rick and all the guys over at Presonus who actually provided the track for this demonstration. They were actually nice enough to send over a track, and I'm not sure all the guys that are in the band. I know Rick is one of the musicians in the band, and I know there's some other guys in the Presonus world over there that are a part of the making of this song. And I'm not really even sure where this song was recorded and whose studio, but I want to thank them for sending over the music and allowing us to work on your song. This was really, really great that you're able to do that. So let's take a look at the original. And here, what I want to show you is this is the original song file, the Presonus song file that Rick had sent over to Johnny and myself for the song Fences. And before we get into, and what I typically do is when someone sends me a song file like this, and this might be a little tip for people that are out there who might be mixing clients' projects in the future, is I never edit the original song file. I always save, we'll go to a save as, and save this as a different, here you could see it's called Fences Original Session. Well, I also, called this, I saved it as Fences Vision Mix for mine. So I always keep the raw original session file intact in case for some crazy reason you need to go back to it. So I never edit the one that was sent over by the client. I always save it as a second copy. So that's just a little tip for you. So here's the original song file. And this song consists of, and I'll let you listen to it in a second. It's a full-on drum kit here. We have a couple of kick drum mics, snare drums. We have some hi-hats, 4 toms. We had some overhead mics, some room mics, some additional room mics, what they called ambient mics, a ride cymbal mic, bass, electric guitar, several lead vocal tracks, I think there's 3, 6, 7, 8 background vocal and chorus vocal type tracks, a bunch of acoustic guitar tracks. So this had a little bit of everything, and also I think a synth track in here. There's also a synth track. Yeah, here we go. There's a synth, like a kind of a keyboard synth in here that does some little fills and stuff throughout the song, which is really cool. So this is pretty much a full-on song, kind of a pop rock type of a track if I had to kind of categorize it. At least that's how I hear it. It's a really great song. I'll let you listen to it here in a second. So this is a pretty full-on song. And the very first thing which makes this particular experiment a pleasure was this song, whoever recorded this and whatever studio recorded this did an excellent job recording these tracks. These tracks were recorded very, very well. And you'll get to hear in a second how this sounds great on its own before I've even done a single thing to it. So one of the things that you might encounter as a mix engineer as you start to work on clients' projects is sometimes you're going to get fortunate and you're going to get someone that really knew what they were doing when they were recording it. And they send you over their session file, and it's like, wow, it's really, really good. I just got to, enhance it, just polish it up, take that raw track that sounds really good, and make it sound great. Those are the nice sessions. And then other times you're going to get people that send stuff in that weren't recorded very well, and those are a lot more challenging to mix. Fortunately for us, this wasn't one of those things. The guys, whoever recorded this, did a wonderful job. So I want to point that out because that's extremely important, especially if you're going to be a mix engineer, but also record people in your own home studio. If you're going to record clients, there's an old saying, which I know you've heard a million times, but I'll say it because it's worth saying a million more times. Get it right at the source. And what I mean by that is when you're recording drums, guitar, bass, vocals, the recording process is such that you want to take the time to really get the good recording at the source. So when you come to mix, it's not this big science project. Everything falls together much more easily, and you have a lot fewer plugins you need to use and a lot fewer, open heart surgery type, EQ moves and stuff to make the track sound great when they're recorded great at the source. So that's an important thing. So if you're actually recording clients in your studio, spend the time, learn how to do mic placement, learn how to get good recorded tracks, learn how to record at a proper level so not everything is clipping and too hot, and all those things that I know you all learn at the Home Studio Trainer site, and that hopefully we'll be able to bring more and more of that type of teaching as well. But that makes a huge difference when you go to mix, is was it recorded well? And this song was recorded very, very well. So let's take a quick listen to it, and I'll shut up here for a second so you could kind of hear what we had to start with. And basically all I did was just took the track and kind of threw the faders up the middle. You can see they're not all at 0 dB, at unity. I just kind of did a quick static mix across all the faders. Not everything is perfectly balanced. I did a little bit of panning, but this is pretty much just so you guys can hear the beginning stages of what this song sounded like. So let's take a quick listen.
Been too long since our last heart to heart. but honesty came knocking at my door. Been so scared every time she took a look around before, but tonight I'm moving into her and out of my comfort zone. And I know I won't let go. Yeah. When I pull her a little bit closer, she sees both halves of my heart. Pull her a little bit closer, sees everything I'm not. Pull her a little bit closer, sees everything we are. And all my fences fall apart. Sometimes all my dreams come so close to free falling.
Okay, so you get the idea. So again, a well-written song, a well-recorded song, and right out of the gate, just taking a quick listen to that, I can tell that this song is going to sound great when it's mixed because it sounds great already. Everything is just kind of thrown up there. I didn't spend more than, I would say, I spent less than 10 minutes doing this static mix to just get it to the point what you just heard. So when you're sitting down in front of a client session and you can, within 10 minutes throw up the faders and get that kind of a sound, you know it's going to be a good day because you know it's going to sound great. And now it's really becomes more of a creative thing more than it becomes a fixing thing in the mixing stage. It's more about, how loud should one instrument be versus another? Should the vocal be a little louder? Should we put a certain type of delay, a certain type of chorus? How should we pan the instruments? Those are all creative things that it's very subjective. And again, you're going to see the way I'm going to do things is I'm going to be a little different to what Johnny's going to do. There's going to be some similarities, I'm sure. I haven't seen Johnny's video and I have not heard his mix yet as of the making of this video, and he hasn't heard mine. But you're going to see some differences and some similarities, but a lot of it's just going to be personal preference. Should the acoustic guitars be, panned completely left and right, hard left and right, or should they be more towards the middle? That's what you're really dealing with when you have something that was recorded this well. Those are the kinds of decisions that you're making more so than the other example would be if this thing was recorded where the vocals were all, didn't sound right, or the singer wasn't a good singer, or the drums weren't mic'd properly, where now you're trying to take something that wasn't recorded well and trying to make it sound great. That's a whole different type of mixing. And we'll get into those kind of examples on future videos and future tutorials. So that's kind of what we're starting with. So now before I show you and I close this down and open up the session file that I worked from where it's completely edited and we go through all the tracks and all the different plugins, I just want to show you, as I said, you have a full-on drum kit here, a ton of tracks here, and I didn't count them, but there's probably close to 30 tracks here. But there were 4 tracks that I took out of the mix that I did not use in my mix, and 2 of those were these 2 tracks here, the ambient room mics. Excuse me. And again, the reason for that was we already had 2 room mics, we already had 2 overheads, and we already had a ride cymbal mic, which I thought was more than enough. And the ambient mics I really didn't feel we needed. And again, when they recorded it, they just threw up as many mics as they felt they wanted to so they can have more options at the mixing stage. And that is a very common thing. So I guess the point is, when you're first going through the tracks and you're listening to a static mix and you're kind of getting familiar with the song, one of the decisions you need to make as a mix engineer is, do I need all these tracks? Does this help the song, or does it just get in the way, or does it not add anything? If it doesn't add anything to the final product, the vision that you have or the artist has, then get rid of it. A lot of studios will record extra room mics on drums if they have the mics and the space to do so, because why not? Maybe you use them, maybe you don't. You don't need to decide at recording. You could decide later. But I took those 2 out. The other thing that I took out was there are 4 tracks here of acoustic, these 4 here. They're not color coded yet. 4 tracks of harmonics. There's a little harmonic guitar riff at the very beginning of the song, which I don't know if you heard here at the beginning. And it looks like it was just the acoustic guitar had 2 mics on it and it was played 2 different times. And when I listened back to it, it sounded almost identical to me, where I didn't feel I needed 4. I could get away with 2 and it would sound just as good. So I got rid of 2 of these tracks and I don't remember which 2. So those are the 4 tracks that you won't see in the next session, just so you know that. All the other tracks I kept because I felt, we needed to keep them, obviously, and I wanted to use as many of the tracks as I could. So again, that's just another bit of information. So what I'm going to do now is close this down, open up the edited session file, and we'll start taking you through step by step how I went about that mix. So I will see you in a second. Okay, welcome back. So now we're looking at the edited song file for this song, Fences. And I'm going to take you through kind of how I set it up, and then quickly how I did maybe some gain staging, so on and so forth. And then we're going to move right into a track by track basis of how I processed the drums, how I processed all the different tracks to get the mix to sound the way that it did. Now, the one thing I'll say up front is that this is obviously kind of a summary, a synopsis of the mix that's already done. I think what Johnny's doing is Johnny's actually doing a video as he's actually mixing the project from start to finish, which is kind of cool. Which you'll be able to see him go through and edit all the tracks and strip out all the silence and color code everything. And he's probably going to take you through everything, which I did not do here. But what we're going to do is as I said in the other video, we have a second song that was sent over by the guys at Presonus. And I'm going to do a video, and Johnny will as well. We're going to do the same experiment and maybe put a couple of little twists into it. On a second song, and on that song I'm going to do just what Johnny's doing for this song, which is I'm actually going to take you through the mix as I'm actually doing it, where this is more of a summary. So if you're looking for that kind of a video, if you really want to see the nitty gritty and the really nuts and bolts of how I go through every single step of the way, you'll see that in the next video. This is kind of just an overview of what was already done. So hopefully this is good enough for you guys. And if it's not, wait for the next video and you'll see the, kind of the concept that Johnny's taking with his video, which is take you from start to finish. So having said that, let's move on. So the very first thing I did, as I said, I took out a couple of the drum mics. I took out a couple of the acoustic guitar mics that we didn't need. And the very first thing as I do is I go ahead and, as you can see up here, I put everything in folders. I have a folder for drums. All my drum tracks are in a folder here. I did the same thing with the electric guitars, and I color code them all. The acoustic guitars are also in another folder. The bass is kind of out here separately. The lead vocals are also grouped together in a folder, all the vocal tracks. And then the synth track is outside of a folder as well. And then what I also did, as you heard a little earlier, was the original raw mix, that static mix that I let you listen to. I actually mixed that down to a 2-track and brought it in here, and we can compare it a little bit later. So you can kind of get the before and after feel. And I do this a lot. Again, just to kind of give maybe another little, mixing tip here, is I always will do a static mix of the original recording, if it was recorded well, like this song was, like I mentioned before, and just bring it on into my session to kind of do a reference mix to make sure that what I'm doing to this thing, it actually sounds better than the original track did when I'm done. And I also use reference tracks as well, famous, artists, and use some reference tracks that are in the kind of same genre, which I did do for the song, but I don't have them in here right now. But just so you know that there's the original track that we listened to a little bit earlier. So we'll do some referencing to that a little bit later on in the video. So again, I group all the tracks, and they didn't come over all grouped together. They didn't have all the drums together and all the different instruments together. There was a stuff that was a little bit disjointed when it came over the original song file. So I grouped everything, color coded it, so it made things easy for me to navigate. And as you can see down here in the mixer, all my drums I typically always use are red, and then I always usually put the bass next to the drums, so the bass and the drums kind of get mixed together. I have a synth track. Here's our electric guitars in green. All the acoustic guitars are in brown. All the vocal tracks are in green. And then down here on the end, I always will bus everything out, group tracks together and bus them out to single buses. So I can control all my instruments over here with just one single fader. So for example, here is my drum bus, which has all these tracks down here in red. If you could look up here, they're all bust out to a drum bus. And then, so that is 4. So if I want to control the volume of my entire drum kit, I can just with this one fader. Once I have the individual drums kind of mixed the way I want them, I can control the overall volume with one fader. And I did the same thing with the electric guitars, same thing with the acoustic. Actually, the acoustics, I have 2 different buses. And as we get through this mix, I'll show you why I did that. The lead vocals are all on a bus, and then all the chorus vocals and all the backing vocals are on its own separate bus, so I can control the lead vocal from the backing vocals together. I had a couple of effects tracks here for sends. I had a reverb and a delay. And also I have another bus here, which I didn't mention. This is called my what I call my P drums. It's actually parallel compressing the drums, and we'll get into why I do that and what it adds to a mix in a little bit. But this is another bus that I actually will send and parallel compress some of the drums to give the drums a little bit more excitement. And I use that as well. So now I can really control my entire song with these 4 or 5 faders here once the individual tracks are kind of all mixed the way I want them in relation to each other, if that makes any sense. So I put everything in folders, I clean up the real estate, I color code everything so things are easy to find and it's easier to navigate. Excuse me. The next thing I do as I'm going through all these tracks, and this has already been done, obviously, as you can see, and Johnny will show you this in his video step by step, I'm sure, is I do what I call cleaning tracks or tidying up tracks. I think Johnny calls them stripping the silence out of the track, where originally the gaps here were all filled with, silence in between these tracks. And I stripped these all out, especially in the drums, and especially in the tom tracks. If the tom was not hit, all the stuff comes before and after the tom hits, I take those out for several reasons. One, because it saves on the way it's a little bit more, it's a little less intensive on your computer, not having to read all this open space here that has no audio. That's part of the reason. But really, for me, I like it because it just looks more organized. It's easier to find things. If everything is just one big solid line of waveforms, and I have all the silence and all the stuff that's, all the silence, say, between here and here, it just doesn't look, it's harder on the eyes for me. It's not as organized for me. It looks more cluttered to me, and I just don't like to work that way. So especially with the toms, like I said, you'll see all these tom mics. You're only going to see minor waveforms, all the stuff that where there weren't hits, all that stuff comes out. So while I'm listening to the mix, and I typically do this as I'm listening to the song before I mix, while I'm cleaning the tracks up, I'm listening to the song and getting familiar with the song, and this takes a little time, and you'll see in the next video that I do with the next song, where I'll actually take you through my process of how I go through this. It probably took me a good 30 minutes or so to actually clean all the tracks up, get all the fades. Whenever you have now an event, I put a fade in and a fade out so you don't get any clicks and pops and all those kinds of things. And that takes a little bit of time, as I said, and I don't rush through it. I try to take my time and do it right, because it makes it easier for me to work in my workflow. And it also gives me time to get familiar with the song as I'm listening to the music while I'm doing that process. So that's the next thing that I do, and I do that for, again, all the tracks. So here's the drums all cleaned up. The electric guitars, not so much, because they play pretty much the entire song, although I probably could have took something out right there as I'm looking at this. But you could see I cut out a bunch of stuff here and I put some fades, here. So all the electric guitar tracks. And then also, again, on the acoustics, same thing. The acoustics, there were some of these acoustic guitar tracks play through the entire song, so there's not much to do except some fades ins and some fade outs. But like in here, where this was all filled in here, got rid of all the stuff. Only want to see what was actually played, okay? And then the bass, again, same thing. Got rid of all the dead space. And then the same thing with the synth. The synth, if it wasn't playing, I got rid of it, as you can see here. So again, I do that while I'm listening to the static mix to get familiar with the song. Once that's done, I do a little bit of gain staging. And what gain staging is, and again, I'll take you through it in detail in the next song that we do, the next set of videos. But basically what you want to do is you want to make sure that you can put this at a pretty much a static mix. And there's different ways to do this. Some guys would say you put all your faders up to 0. And I've actually wrote this on the blog post on the Home Studio Trainer. You want to start off with all your faders at 0 dB at Unity, your master fader at 0 dB. You want to play your song back, and you want to make sure that none of your individual tracks are clipping or causing the buildup of all your individual tracks to make this master fader clip. I like to make sure that before I even start mixing, that my master fader, my peak volume, is around -10 to -12 dB. That's where I like to start, to give myself plenty of headroom for the mixing process when you're adding compressors and adding things that are going to boost the overall volume of individual tracks. You want to make sure you're starting off at a very conservative level. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Some guys will say you can mix, you could start off at a -6. Some guys will tell you -18. I found that -10 to -12 dB is a good starting point. So if I had all my faders at 0 dB and play back the song, if my master fader was going above -10, -12, I would find the offending tracks that were causing that to happen, and I would start to either, there's a couple of ways you could do it. You can go on, let's say if it was the tom, this track here was causing that problem, you can put what Presonus is known as the mix tool. You could put that in as your first insert on that track, and you could turn down the gain so the gain is not clipping. And again, this is already a finished song, so I can't show you that example here, but I will in the next video. But that's just the concept. That's one way to do it. You can use the mix tool as like kind of a trim control or a gain control before it hits the fader, so you can bring down that level so your fader's not clipping when it's at when it's at unity 0 dB. The other way to do it is you could just highlight the event like I do here, and you could just kind of turn this up or down. If this was, the offending track, you could turn that up or down. You could see here it's moving up or down, plus or minus a couple of dB. You could do that. That's another way to do it. Depending on, in this particular song, as I said a few times, it was recorded so well, the levels were recorded properly. I really didn't have anything come in too hot, so to speak, where I had to do a lot of gain staging. So I put everything at 0 dB. My master fader at that time was running at around -6 or so, a little bit lower than that. So all I did was just pull down, looked at the tracks that were causing that, and I just pulled the faders down from 0 dB a little bit. You could do that too. You don't have to start at 0 dB. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have a fader, for example, that when you try to do a static mix to get it to not clip, it's all the way to heck up here where it was recorded too low, or all the way down here that you got to turn it down so much that there's nowhere to really move, because as soon as you move it from here to here, it's clipping. You want to be somewhere in this ballpark. If unity is ideal, you want to be, somewhere between here and here, from maybe 0 to, maybe -5, -6 dB. If you're somewhere in that ballpark, for me, that works. And again, I'm sure there's guys that are watching this that'll disagree with that. That's what seems to work for me. But the point of it is, you don't want the master fader, in my mind, going above -10 dB when everything is playing back. So you want all the faders to be somewhat in the middle of the channel here, somewhere in the middle of the total throw of this fader, somewhere towards the middle where the master fader's not clipping. So that's the next thing I do, is I made sure everything is kind of gain stage, so we're ready to get it into and to start mixing the project. Okay, so we've color coded the tracks, we've got rid of all the dead space, cleaned them up, tidied them up, stripped the silence, however you want to call it, grouped everything in folders, color coded, did some gain staging. Our master fader was writing right around -12, -13. That's where I like it. And then we begin the mixing process. So let me first start with the master bus and show you the plugins that I use. And again, I use only third-party plugins. Now, typically, I would use some stock plugins. When I was using Pro Tools for many years in Cubase, there were a lot of their plugins that I would use in conjunction with some third-party stuff. So this was kind of a nice test for me, because I couldn't use any of the Presonus stuff. I only could use third-party stuff. So it forced me to use some plugins that I haven't used in a while, which is kind of a trip. And that's always a good thing to do too. If you ever, are inclined to do so, maybe you take one of your songs that you're working on and only work with the Presonus stuff, and then maybe only work with third-party stuff, or use a set of plugins that you haven't used in so long and just try to make them work. In my mind, an EQ is an EQ is an EQ, whether I'm using a Presonus EQ or a Waves EQ or a Universal Audio EQ. They may sound a little different, but they all basically do the same thing. And it's a good thing to change it up every now and again, and to learn what these different plugins do and how they sound different, and how they work differently, and how you have to adjust them differently to get the result that you desire. So on the master bus, and you're going to find these two plugins I use on all my tracks, but let me show you my master bus. So I always have 3 plugins that I use in the master bus before I even start mixing. The very first plugin is made by Slate Digital, and again, I'll put all these links in the description, and I'll pop up on the screen once I edit this video, so you guys can go check these out if you want to. I use what's called the Virtual Console Collection, the VCC by Slate Digital. This is their virtual mix bus. Basically, this plugin emulates 5 different high-profile vintage consoles that have had thousands and thousands of records, professional records made on them over the years. They have an SSL, the Brit 4K is an SSL. The USA console is a API. The Brit N is actually a Neve console. This little funny symbol here is a Trident console. And then the old RC tube. And this kind of gives it that more warm, vintagey sound, kind of like a tape saturation does, which I use as well, which I'll show you in a second. So this is, if you're looking for like that vintage type of a sound, I think in the Presonus plugins, I use the soft tube, which I haven't used that. It's kind of a tape saturation, kind of an analog type of a plugin. I'm not too familiar with it, so forgive me if I'm not classifying it correctly. I'm sure Johnny uses that in his video. But this gives that warm vintage vibe. The VCC by Slate Digital. I love this plugin. If I had to, it's probably out of all the third-party stuff I have, this particular plugin, the VCC collection, to me is by far the best set of plugins I've ever purchased. If you want that nice, warm, analog type vibe, this is a great plugin to have. So I use that as the first plugin in my insert bank. The second plugin I use, let me just close this one for a second. Rearrange that, is the a mix bus compressor, and I use a few different ones, but for this song I use the Universal Audio SSL G series stereo bus compressor. Now if you don't know what Universal Audio is, you can go to Universal Audio, Google it. I think it's universalaudioUSA.com, I think is the website. What they are specialized in is these the emulations of these old vintage pieces of gear, compressors, EQs, channel strips, so on and so forth. Some of the most sought after pieces of hardware that has ever been built. They have meticulously gone through and modeled these things to give, again, that in the digital domain, that old analog type of a vibe, type of a feel. And this is one of those plugins. And Universal Audio, what I really like about Universal Audio, and I've always used Universal Audio plugins, 80% of what I do when I mix, no matter what DAW I was using, I would always use Universal Audio for a couple of reasons. One, because they have this old vintage gear that I really like the sound of, and that's kind of the vibe that I go for more times than not when I'm mixing a project. And two, Universal Audio, the way their plugins work is they have a DSP card that you plug into a PCI slot on your computer. So all the plugins and everything run off this secondary hardware card inside of your computer, whether it's a Mac or a PC. So what that does is it takes all the taxing off your CPU. So all the plugins that you're going to see today from Universal Audio, not any of them are taxing the CPU, which is great. So if you have a computer that maybe isn't, has a ton of horsepower in it, and you're always running in problems where, third-party plugs or even stock plugins, if you have a 40 or 50 session track session, you start loading up 20, 30, 40 plugins, your computer starts to bog down. One of the advantages of something like Universal Audio is not only do they make wonderful plugins, but again, it puts relief on your CPU because it's running off this card inside of your computer. And not to mention, they sound fantastic. So again, I'll put the website on the screen. If you've never used Universal Audio stuff, I encourage you to kind of check it out. I will tell you they're a little pricey. They're not the cheapest plugins in the world, but they really sound amazing. And you'll get to hear some of, obviously, demonstrations of this as we go through it. So that's my mix bus compressor by Universal Audio SSL. That's my second plugin in the chain. And then lastly, I mix out to another Slate Digital plugin called the Virtual Tape Machines. And this, again, if you're looking for that analog vintage kind of a sound, this is another wonderful plugin. I think, again, Presonus's soft tube kind of emulates tape, I believe. Universal Audio makes tape plugins. Waves makes tapes plugins. There's lots of companies that make them. I like this, and I've used all of them. I've had the Universal Audio stuff, which is far more expensive than this plugin, and I've used the Wave stuff. I like this particular tape machine better for a couple of reasons. One is that it's actually two tape machines in one. It is actually on the master bus. It's actually, you're mixing down to 1/2 inch. It's a 2-track 1/2 inch tape. And on all the individual channels, which I'll show you in a second, I use the same exact plugin, but it also has, as you can see up here, it's a 2-inch. So the concept is that you record into a 2-inch tape machine, mix your project through a bus compressor, and then out to the 1/2 inch, which is really nice. Again, go to slatedigital.com, check this out. It's a really good tape machine plugin. So that's the virtual tape machine. So I always use Slate Digital counts, the VCC, followed up by the bus compressor, and then finally the virtual tape machines. Okay, now that we've taken a look at the master bus and the effects on the master bus and my effects chain, we're going to go through track by track and show you how I mix this song. So before we get into the drums, because that's typically where I start a mix, is at the drums, let's take a quick listen to this original raw mix, which is the static mix that I played for you a little earlier, that I brought into my DAW here. And then I will play the final mix so you could kind of hear where we were in its raw state to where I ended up, and then we could talk about the detail on how I got there in the plugins that I used. So just so, for point of information, the original mix is going through here, and it's going out a reference out track. I set up a set of outputs that was separate from my main outs, so the original reference raw mix, static mix, if you will not be processed by the plugins on the master bus. And here's another tip. If some newbies out there are wondering why I would do that, it's really for more when I bring professional mixes into my DAW, so I can reference my mix against a professional mix. You don't want that professional mix that's already been mastered going through your signal chain here on your master out. You could just, I guess, click this button and turn off all your effects. But to me, if you forget to do that, now you're playing your reference track through your bus compressor, through my Slate Digital plugins, and it's going to process that master track even further, and you're not really comparing apples to apples. So by setting up a separate output, which I call reference out, I can run any reference tracks through that, so it's not actually going through the main fader here like my recording session is. So in order to do that, if you don't know, you just go to Studio One, go to Preferences, Audio Setup, and then Song Setup, and go to the outputs of your interface. And here's my main outs that go out 17 and 18 on my interface, and then I added one called Reference Out that go out 17 and 18. So so it does never hits the reference track, and then you just hit OK. So my reference track here, in this case, the original static mix is going to the output called reference out, not the main outs, which have my signal chain here on my master bus. So hopefully that clears that up for you. So let's take a quick listen to the original one last time, and then I'll play you the final mix, and then we'll get into the details. So here we go.
Too long since our last heart to heart, but honesty came knocking at my door. Been so scared every time she took a look around before, but tonight I'm moving into her and out of my comfort zone. And I know I won't let go. When I pull her a little bit closer, she sees both halves of my heart. Pull her a little bit closer, sees everything I'm not. Pull her a little bit closer, sees everything we are. And all my fences fall apart.
Okay, so that's the original static mix that we listened to a little bit earlier, and now here's that same section of music of my final mix, and then we'll get into the details. So here we go.
Like the rainfall, yeah. Too long since our last heart to heart, but honesty came knocking at my door. Been so scared every time she took a look around before, but tonight I'm moving into her and out of my comfort zone. And I know I won't let go. sometimes so much.
Okay, so there we go. So that was the final mix. And again, the original mix, you know, the tracks were recorded really well, as I said a few times. So now we just took that and enhanced it. Now, keep in mind that the final mix has not been mastered. As you can see over here on my master out, we were peaking at around negative 6 dB, which is kind of where I like to end up at the end of a mix. We said we started off around negative 10, negative 12. By the time the mix is done, we're at negative 6. So that's why you didn't hear this great volume change between the finished mix and the original mix, because they're both pretty much around the same, negative 6 in volume, because it hasn't been mastered yet. And as you can tell, there's no limiter here. If I was just going to mix this quick and send it out to someone, I would throw a limiter on here and bring up the volume a little bit. But this track will probably master, so we could do another set of tutorials. So that's why the volume is a little on the low side. Again, I like to be conservative, give the mastering process, whether and the mastering engineer, whether it's myself or having it done by someone else, plenty of headroom, so they have a lot places to, you know, a lot of room to move as far as volume goes. So that's the mix. Hopefully you guys enjoyed hearing part of that. Now let's get into the tracks and talk a little bit about you know, how I went ahead and processed this. And again, to remind everyone, I used only third-party stuff. No Presonus plugins were allowed. That was the edict that Johnny gave me. So I couldn't use any Presonus stuff, which kind of bummed me out a little bit because I like some of their plugins. But anyway, so as we talked a little bit earlier, I usually start with the drums. And so all my drums are color-coded here in red. And as I said earlier, I took out a couple of the ambient mics that were a part of the original session file and only left the two room mics and the two overheads for my room sound. So let's start off with in a couple, maybe a couple other tips too, just again, mixing tips as I'm thinking these things off the top of my head. A couple of things that I do when I start off a mix after I get everything set up and organized like we talked about already. Number one is I always mix at a low volume level. I never mix at high volume levels. Low enough so you could be sitting next to me here in my studio. We can be having a conversation right up here at the console in front of the monitors, and we don't have to struggle to hear each other. The thinking is, if you can mix at a low volume level and get the drums really punchy and the track really slamming and things are nice and clear, and you can hear everything and things sound big and full at a low volume, when you turn that up, it's going to sound even better. When you mix at a higher volume level, you tend to trick your ears into thinking that louder is better, and therefore you don't make the same smart decisions with EQ and compression and the way you pan things the way you would at a lower volume level. You have to do a lot more critical listening. So that's just a tip. And the second thing I always do, which I won't do here, is I always mix in mono. I very rarely ever mix in stereo. I only use stereo at the final part of the mix or when I'm checking stuff. And the reason for that is, again, when things are spread out across the stereo field, it's much easier to hear everything. When you bring everything to the center and you mix in mono, you have to listen a lot more critical of an ear to make sure that you could hear everything properly, to make sure that things are EQ'd in a way that makes sense. So then when you bring it back to stereo, it sounds bigger, it sounds fuller. So if you can get a track sounding really good in mono, when you put that thing in stereo, it's going to sound great. Now, obviously, you'll have to, once you put it into stereo, you have to make sure things are panned the way you want them. You won't hear that effect when it's in mono. Also, you got to remember, once you're outside of your control room, whether you're listening to music in a car or whether you're listening to something on a laptop, you know, more times than not, you're not listening in perfect stereo like you are when you're sitting in your control room. So it's another trick that I've learned many, many years ago. If you can mix in mono and mix at a low volume level, and you can get the track sounding really good, when you bring it to stereo and crank that volume up, it's going to sound even better. But I'm going to keep us in stereo, as you can see here on the master fader. In Studio One, you just click this little button and it obviously it sums everything to mono for when you're mixing. I'm sure you guys know that, but if you're new to Studio One, maybe you didn't know that. So we're going to keep this in stereo as we move forward, but I just wanted to throw that out as I thought of it as I was working my way through this. So okay, so let's start off with the drums. So the very first thing I do is we had two kick drum tracks. We had an inside and an outside kick. And on the inside kick, which is this first one here, I used a couple of different plugins. And like I said about the master bus, you're going to see these two plugins on all of my channels. The first plugin that I used, and I'll open it up here, was the Slate Digital Virtual Tape Machines. Again, so to take you back for a second, the concept is, if you're trying to get that analog sound and you're trying to record maybe the way they did when analog was the only way to record, you would record straight off the floor into a 16-track tape machine. the signal would come out of that 16-track tape machine, go into a big console, whether it's a Neve or an SSL or an API or a Trident, a big desk, right, in a control room. Signal goes through the channel faders, if you can visualize that, and then out through the center section of the console over to the mix bus compressor, and you would mix out to a mix bus compressor, and then from the mix bus compressor out of the console into the half-inch tape. And as I showed you earlier, this virtual tape machines by Slate Digital is really 2 plugins in one. If you look over here, you can see the toggle switch flips up and down. On the individual channels, the instrument tracks, you're gonna record to the 2-inch 16-track, okay, the 2-inch, and you can adjust the inches per second and the type of tape and stuff. And we'll get into the actual nuts and bolts of this plugin on another video. But here's an overview of it. Okay, so this is on every single one of my channels. If I were to bring up the mixer and you were to look at all my inserts, starting over at the drums. And you'll see across the very first plugin on all of my tracks is the virtual tape machine, okay? And then when I get over to the main out on the mix bus, and then the second plugin on all the channels is the virtual console, which I'll talk about again in a second. And then on the mix bus, we go over to the virtual console and then to the virtual tape machines.